Nowadays, we can eat whatever food we like. We have a variety of food from every country in the world. We can pick and choose. But in the 1800s, the poor people didn't have any choice. They only had one food. This was it, the potato.
Then in the 1840s, a catastrophe hit Ireland. The potato crop went bad and rotted because of a disease called potato blight. Thousands died of starvation and fever, and thousands more left the country. This was the Great Famine.
In this programme, we're going to try to find out why the Great Famine happened and what effect it had on Ireland. Why was the loss of the potato crop so important? And did nobody try to stop it?
In 19th century Ireland, few people owned the land they farmed, and too many tried to make a living off the overcrowded land. The landlord owned the land, and he could throw his tenants off it at any time. A man would rent a patch of ground, and on the patch of ground he grew potatoes for his family. If the crop failed, he faced starvation. It was not uncommon for the crop to fail. Famine was no stranger in Ireland.
I confess that annually recurring starvation in Ireland gives me more uneasiness than any other evil existing in the United Kingdom.
The population of Ireland increased dramatically in the 1800s. As the population grew, so did the pressure on the land. Farms were subdivided and divided again amongst families until plots became incredibly small. By 1841, there were over 8 million people living in Ireland.
When people went to harvest their crops in 1845, they found that the potatoes had been attacked by a new disease. The Latin name for it was Phytophthora infestans, or something like that, but it was more commonly known as potato blight.
As people stepped through the drills in the morning, they noticed a strange, sickly sweet smell. The tops of the plants were strong, but the crops were rotten in the ground.
I was startled to hear a rumour that all the potato fields in the district were blighted, and went out to visit my crop. I found them lush and in full blossom, promising a rich harvest. 5 days later, I went back to the potato fields. My feelings may be imagined, and before I saw the crop, I smelt the fearful stench. The stalks still looked green and healthy, but I knew that the crop was worthless. Within hours, the stalks withered, leaves decayed, the potatoes themselves rotten, the stench from so much rotten vegetation was almost unbearable.
All over the country, potatoes were rotting in the fields. The people scavenged, grubbing the earth for roots, eating leaves off the trees and scouring the bushes for berries. Meanwhile, teams of horses were drawing wagons of wheat, oats, vegetables and meat to Irish ports, where they would be shipped to England. All this food had been grown in Ireland, and the police guarded this food that the hungry people themselves had helped to harvest.
Ireland was in a desperate state, but the British government's policy was not to interfere with trade or the economy. This policy was known as laissez-faire, which is French for let be or leave it alone. They thought that it wasn't the government's job to give aid to its citizens. People were supposed to be self-sufficient. They were supposed to be able to look after themselves.
The government was still run by wealthy landowners and aristocrats who thought that people were poor because they were lazy. But the British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, became concerned about reports of the famine in Ireland. He secretly arranged to import maize from America and sold it to those who had lost their potato crop. But it was not allowed to be given out free, because that would bring down the price of corn and big farmers would lose money.
Although the famine hit the north, Ulster did not suffer as much as other areas.
Some people believed that it was the government and not the potato blight that was to blame for the famine. It was an Ulster Protestant who came up with the simplest and most extreme explanation. He said that millions of men and women had been peacefully slain by the English government. He was John Mitchell.
John Mitchell was born in 1815 in County Londonderry. He was educated in Trinity College, Dublin. He was a great radical and wrote for the revolutionary journal The Nation. He was inspired by the revolutions sweeping through Europe, and he called for an open Irish rebellion against England. He was arrested and transported to Australia. In 1853, he escaped and headed for America. During the American Civil War, he supported the South. He returned to Ireland, and in 1875 he was elected MP for Tipperary. He died a few months later.
In 1846, the potato harvest was attacked by blight again, and the crop was destroyed. This time, the people had nothing left. This time, the government couldn't ignore what was happening in a part of the United Kingdom. Even then, there was bad planning and confusion, and corrupt officials cheated the government's schemes. Squads of people raided the food depots, but you could buy plenty of food if you had money.
Yesterday they had no breakfast, no dinner, no supper. It seemed the day before, and the day before that. It seemed today, and tomorrow, and the day after. They're overpowered with hunger. Thousands, aye, hundreds of thousands have sunk down, sickened, and died.
At the end of 1846, the government began to force people to work on often useless schemes like building roads that went nowhere or bridges and piers. But the people were weak from hunger and had hardly enough energy to stand, let alone do heavy work.
I think the honourable and learned gentleman will agree that it is wise not to be too liberal. A great dependence must fall on the spontaneous charity of the landed proprietors and others. There is an undoubted claim upon the landowners who failed to come forward at this time of great distress.
But most of the landlords ruthlessly evicted the people who couldn't pay their rent. The police and the army smashed the house down and threw the family out onto the roads to join the other half-skeletons travelling the country. There were a few good landlords, like the Gore Booths in County Sligo. They reduced the rents of their tenants and sometimes cancelled them. Some landlords even went bankrupt during the famine. Some, like George Dawson, opened a soup kitchen to feed the starving.
From the moment I open the door in the morning until dark, I have a crowd of women and children crying out for something to save them from the starving. I turned my kitchen into a bakery and soup shop to enable me to feed the miserable children and mothers. So great is the distress that they actually faint on getting food into their stomachs.
Millions of people roamed Ireland, heading for the towns, but dying by the roadside. The government thought the people were poor because they were lazy, and so they built the dreaded workhouses. Here, poor people were forced to work in exchange for food and clothes.
Workhouses were unpleasant places. Families were separated. Husband from wife, child from parent, and discipline was strict. For those starving in Ireland, there was no choice. There was no social welfare system, no dole, no council houses, no NHS. Famine fever gripped the workhouses. Typhus and cholera became widespread.
It has been impossible to provide dry beds in the case of those wetted by weak, ill children. And this sleeping upon wet beds has increased fever and bowel complaints. The dreadful mortality which has swept the workhouse is caused by the sour bread and putrid broth made of rotten beef, like the flesh of an animal that has died of disease.
By 1847, the work schemes were costing the government too much money, and Charles Edward Trevelyan, a civil servant in the Treasury, suggested a new plan. The local ratepayers would provide soup kitchens. Now, the landlords didn't want to encourage these soup kitchens because they were paying for them. The food was nasty and poor. The soup was a type of porridge called stirabout, and each person got £1 a day.
Charles Edward Trevelyan was born in Devon in 1807. He joined the Indian Civil Service and then returned to England for a job in the Treasury in 1838. During the famine in Ireland, he was opposed to generous government aid. He believed in the policy of laissez-faire. He opposed the closure of Irish ports to stop the export of food. He believed that the Irish famine was a natural disaster designed to relieve overpopulation. He was knighted in 1848. He died in 1886.
You might have heard of the expression, taking the soup, which means a Catholic converting to being a Protestant. It comes from the famine times of souperism, when a person was only allowed to take soup if they gave up the Catholic faith. But in reality, this only happened in a few places, run by rather over-enthusiastic Protestants. The soup kitchen policy saved more lives than any other form of relief. Over 3 million people a day were given free food. That was half the population of Ireland at the time. By the end of 1847, the situation had improved. Soup kitchens were closed and the local workhouse was the only relief. Private charities and individuals also tried to help. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, were among the best at distributing food. Irishmen in the British Army in India clubbed together and sent £50,000. North America gave generously. One of the kindest gifts came from Oklahoma. A Choctaw tribe of Indians scraped together $170 and sent it to Ireland. Every little bit helped. And a lot of decent individuals did try to do their best. Mr. Moore, a coast guard from Donegal, sailed to Sligo and brought back supplies for some starving families.
I never saw anything like it, and I hope I never will. People walked 18 miles for a little meal which I could not give. 14 tons, all but one bag, went in a single day.
As famine and disease spread through Ireland, many people emigrated to Liverpool, Glasgow, or even as far as North America. Sometimes the landlord even paid their fare. Well, it was cheaper than trying to feed people. The emigration trade grew enormous. Around 1 million people crossed the Atlantic to America. Greedy ship owners preyed on the unfortunate passengers. Many never even reached the new land. The ships were overcrowded and often not seaworthy. In bad weather, the journey across the Atlantic could take 7 weeks. The food was poor and disease spread. Conditions were so awful that they were called coffin ships. The Great Famine changed Ireland forever. Well, the population decreased for a start. 1 million died of hunger and disease, and 1 million emigrated. The custom of subdividing land was discouraged, and a farm was to be inherited by only one son. The numbers of larger farms increased as the cottier class almost died out. Fewer workers were needed as landlords turned to livestock farming. So millions more headed for foreign shores. The British government spent £7 million on famine relief in Ireland, but at the same time spent £60 million on the Crimean War. Opinions vary on the true range of causes of the famine, or where the blame lay. One thing for sure is that many of the poor Catholic peasants who survived blamed the Westminster government for what happened.
Now, you may find yourself thinking that, of course, the famine was terrible, but it couldn't happen now. We do things better now. We've moved on from those dark days. But it does happen, and it is still happening. And people are still talking about the right way to deal with famine. Is famine aid right? Does the food and the money get to the right people? We have all of the advantages of technology that they didn't have in the 19th century, yet we still stumble on the same pitfalls of confused government policy and mismanagement. We still seem to find excuses for something that is inexcusable.
My son, I loved our native land with energy and pride, until the blight came on the land, the sheep and cattle died. The rent and taxes were to pay, I could not them redeem, and that's the cruel reason why I left old Skibbereen. It's well I do remember that bleak December day. The landlord and the sheriff came to drive us all away. They set my roof on fire with their demon yellow spleen, and that's another reason why I left old